Hello, and welcome to Tadaima 2022. My name is Julie Abo, and I'm a member of the Tadaima 2022 Steering Committee. And this next panel is titled Speaking Out and Calling in with Bravery and Humility, a multi-generational conversation with Dr. Ravi Chandra. I was inspired after reading Ravi Chandra's article on 8 types of humility needed for cognitive clarity as I struggle and I see this struggle in intergenerational conflict within my own family and my work within the Japanese American community. I did leave out the word trauma for the moment because I want to think about the multi generational aspect. His opening idea is that humility helps cultivate empathy and relatedness. It really gave me a glimpse of hope for helping and healing some of this inner conflict. I thought we could all benefit from an intergenerational conversation, a difficult conversation about these concepts to give ourselves some clarity. So I'd like to introduce our main speaker today. Ravi Chandra, MD, is a psychiatrist, writer, and compassion educator in San Francisco and a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He writes for Psychology Today and East Wind Easing, where his long form essays are written, quote, at the intersection of Black and Asian lives, end quote. His debut documentary, The Bandaged Place, From AIDS to COVID and Racial Justice, won Best Film at the 2021 Cannes Independent Film Festival, which you can watch on demand on Vimeo. And his book, Face Buddha Transcendence in the Age of Social Networks, is his full length nonfiction debut and winner of the 2017 Nautilus Silver Book Award for Religion, Spirit, and Spirituality of Eastern Thought. He is also a dear friend of Tsuru for Solidarity and was a wonderful guide during the early days of the pandemic, which is where I met him. So thank you so much. I'd like to welcome Ravi Chandra.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me all right? All right, good. Yes, so thank you, Julie, and thank you to Dadaima for inviting me here today. And welcome to all my fellow panelists and everyone in the listening audience. And I guess people will be listening to this later as well. And we all come to these discussions with diverse experiences. We have very diverse families with a variety of intrafamilial pressures. We come perhaps with mental health conditions and social disconnections, and disconnection is at the root of suffering, and the opposite of suffering is belonging. So I hope our discussion will create a greater island of belonging for us, as that we can carry forward and to create ripples as we move forward. I guess I value a cool head and a good heart, but those are very hard to maintain under difficult times and difficult relationships. And difficult conversations can sometimes pull us into such tension intrapsychically and between us. And I think we'd like to value our interpersonal relationships. I think our family relationships, but sometimes we can be on different pages emotionally. So the question is how to steer that conflict and that difficulty and maintain and hopefully cultivate cool heads and good hearts in difficult times. I think one common feature that we all share is that we have all been in close quarters with great peril. And this opening image of that Tadaima uses, that gigantic outsized watchtower over the barracks and the humans below them, I think is very instructional about this quality of great peril that has informed many Japanese American lives and also my life. I am a 1.8 generation Indian American immigrant. I came to the South from India at about the age of 2 with my soon-to-be single mother. We lived in Tuskegee, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee, St. Louis, Missouri, predominantly in Black neighborhoods and Black communities, and she worked for inner city hospitals. And then we moved north to Flint, Michigan, and Detroit, Michigan. And there was a dislocation there, which I couldn't really understand at that age. And so had confusion about racial issues, but also a deep tie to the Black community. Um, and some of my earliest experiences when we were in Tuskegee, um, I was told by a boy on the playground, "Your skin's dirty." And then I actually went home and tried to scrub myself with Ajax. And, my mom said, "Oh, that won't go. That color won't go." But we didn't really understand racism at the time. And then in St. Louis, my fifth grade teacher, an African American woman in a predominantly white school, I was bused initially from a Black neighborhood and a Black school to a white neighborhood and white school. And the my African American teacher said that when she moved into the neighborhood, the for sale signs went up. And so I was very confused. And I said in my very naive, I asked a very naive question, why would they do that? Right. And this brought tears to her eyes. So these are the early incidents of that just the tip of the iceberg of the racial trauma that is part of this country and is part of the disconnection. Um, and so I'm fortunate to have had enough good relationships in my life to promote good relationships as a psychiatrist and as a community member. But there's always challenges, especially at this time. Right now, there are great tensions, and I'll just describe an incident recently. It just happened 3 weeks ago, and maybe that could be a springboard for discussion. So I was at a South Asian film festival with my mother, and we knew some of the people there who were gathered outside, and there was another couple of women, South Asian American women, who we started talking to, and my mom introduced herself and described that she'd lived in the South for 30 years before she relatively recently moved out to California. And she said, "Oh, yes, the people in the South in her small town, Rome, Georgia, were very nice and kind and so forth." And the two women agreed. And I said, "Well, they were very nice and kind, and my mom could ask for help in the middle of the night, but they also 85% of them voted for Donald Trump, and they sent Marjorie Taylor Greene to the House." And immediately there's just without, I mean, I hadn't planned this, but immediately there was a whole range of defensiveness that came out. And One of the South Asian American women who happened to be a therapist, she said, "Well, they may have voted for Trump, but they're really good and kind people." And I said, "Well, it's hard to believe because they voted for a man who's a pathological liar and a criminal and so forth." And so I kind of, didn't let any ground go on that. And so she said, "Well, that may be true of him, but they're fine." And then immediately, as she recognized that we were on different sides of this, she said, "Well, blacks are attacking Asians in San Francisco." And I was just shocked because she immediately went to a kind of a racist characterization of things. And then I said, "Well, actually, most of the attacks on Asians have been by whites statistically." But she doubled down and she said some other things, and she said, "Well, uh, that the real violence has come from the left, and from and she quoted some European philosopher or something like that." And I said, "Well, that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, obviously fascism and Nazism and so forth were not kind of leftist movements. What does that have to do with our situation today?" So in other words, she betrayed these fears about social movements, and I think as I had this difficult 2 minutes with her, and then kind of let go, and I haven't seen her again, but but these are moments of friction where I think she revealed, I call it a personality biopsy on the streets, where she revealed really a fear about what was going on, and just, I mean, a complicity with structures of power, because she didn't understand or want to see diversity, and the calls for equity and social justice in properly, and was instead very defensive about them. So in other words, and I think I tried to retain my sense of her as a human being, but it was this intense, conflicting moment, where we both kind of revealed ourselves to each other, and I think I was able to, upon reflection, see the great vulnerability that she carried, and lack of understanding about issues, and that was, that helps me kind of understand uh, what's coming at us in a different way. So we're going to talk about having difficult conversations, but I think, I don't want to idealize this. There are moments of conflict where you kind of, things happen very quickly, and then it's about, if it's a relationship. I mean, these kinds of situations can happen with family members or friends, and then how do you keep a cool head, or and retain the good heart that recognize that we may be in a state of, as my publisher at Eastwind Ezine says, we may be in this state of a warring mind states, conflicting ideas and opinions, but how do we kind of come back to valuing each other and recognizing we're all just human beings, we're all just works in progress. And so so I think this is the challenge, as we carry these issues of racial justice, solidarity, allyship, and really, I think, from my side, pushing for nonviolent solutions and understandings in a time when unfortunately, as I mentioned at the outset, we've all experienced great peril, and we've all been in close quarters with great peril, and we that's right at the surface right now. So there's understandable fear and tension and defensiveness, but it's all vulnerability exposed. Okay, so I guess my time is up. Thank you for listening, and I hope this is a springboard into our discussion.
Thank you so much. So now, after having that wonderful explanation, we're going to bring in three more people to join the conversation. So we're going to bring on Mary Tanaka Abo, who is a Nisei who was born in Juneau, Alaska in 1940 and incarcerated with her family at Minidoka. She's a retired teacher, and she's my mother. Next, we have Mike Ishii, who is a Yonsei living in New York City, where he has split his time as a performing artist, organizer, and clinician, and he's a co-leader and co-founder of Tsuru for Solidarity. Thanks, Mike, for joining us. And then we also have Rikyo Inoue, who is a Yonsei and grew up in Los Angeles. He spent 3 years teaching English on the JET program in Toyama Prefecture, and he returned to the U.S. for graduate school on the East Coast. And he has been a multi-generational discussion leader and believes these conversations are essential to building a sustaining a wonderful community. Thank you all for joining us today. So I guess what we'll do first is just have a response to what Ravi was saying, and what are things that we can see also within our own community. So first we'll go with Mary.
Thank you, Ravi. I was struck by what you said about a cool head and a good heart. I think often in my interactions, I have a hot head, but I assume the good heart. And I think that's not a good assumption. I'm sure Julie will agree. But when you mentioned the movie situation where you spoke your piece, it reminded me of when I was about 12 and my mother wanted me to take her to see this movie Go for Broke about the 442, and I was actually mortified because we were the only Japanese in the whole community of Juneau, Alaska, and I had by that time grown to be ashamed to be Japanese because of that. So I did take her grudgingly to the movie, and I was just cringing through the whole movie because it showed, Japanese from Japan fighting the Japanese. I thought the Japanese that were on screen fighting were the enemy, but they were the 442. So I didn't really know any history. And after the movie, I just didn't want to be seen with her. And we walked we walked out of the movie theater, and she walked on one side and I walked to the other side until we got to our house. And I just kind of marveled that she didn't scold me or make me feel ashamed. She just didn't talk about it. And in this way, I felt that it was like a reveal to me, as you had mentioned. We have these reveals where we kind of know ourselves, we know the other person. That she had an understanding of my feelings that I didn't really know. What came to me was I was ashamed of being ashamed. So as I was growing up, I was 2 years old when we went to Camp Mitadoka, and it was kind of a happy time for me because she and I were together all the time for 3 years. So it was a really good bonding situation. Uh, and I, but when we came back to Juneau, she had to work, and our lives separated. And so she became a different person to me. And I think she would be like someone you had mentioned, where you become a dominant person, and she tells you what to do, like go to bed, eat, don't study. I mean, these were these directives that she gave me. The other part of her was I didn't see that much of her. She would say things like come on, and keep focused, don't kitty kitty kitty, don't mess around. And so I kind of uh, uh, grew up that way. She was like a tiger inside the family, but outside the family, she was like this quiet, demure person. So I knew her as an inside person and an outside person, and I think Julie can see that I too might have carried on those characteristics.
Yeah, so I'll go next. So I'm Sansei. So my mom's Nisei, I'm Sansei. And what you said, Ravi, about reacting from that place of trauma is really difficult. And I also went inward too into my family. Actually, I mean, I what you said made me think also about what's happening in the media, what's happening externally. But I also went inwards and thought of my family, like what Mom you were saying is it's really interesting. Um, that you said the whole thing about the tiger on the inside, like inside the family, but then the mouse on to the outside of the family. And I feel like we had that relationship too. And it was really difficult for me. And but now that we're older, I think that I do try to have humility and understand, because now I've learned so much about the incarceration and the trauma. And so, but it's still difficult for me, right? Like as Ravi was saying, when we still have our arguments, right? And we're in the moment, and it's hard to get out of that. So, uh, thinking about, I think again, it feels kind of like we're talking like this sometimes, right? Because I think you were telling me sometimes you keep wanting me to fit in to what your mother's ideal was. Like I am younger than you, so I'm just supposed to obey you without questioning. And and I'm saying, no, but you need to understand me as a person. And so there's that generational gap. And it's hard to now we can sit back and talk about it, but when we're in the moment, we're just it's like this, right? And it's hard to communicate or have a meaningful conversation. So, um, thinking about what Robbie's written and what he said, I also kind of see that happening in my work. Just in the community, I see sometimes there's these conversations that are happening that are like this and conflict, and there's actually no resolution even when the conflict is over because we each sort of had our own interpretation of what happened. Um, so what we want to do is have more of this, right, and more connecting happening. So I hope I'm making sense. I feel like I'm talking in sort of these general terms. Um, but thanks, Mom, for sharing that. And I could see very quickly how the personal does become also um, very very public as well. So I'll pass that on to Mike.
Thank you, Julie, and Ravi. Thank you for leading this discussion. I'm really honored to be asked to join this conversation. It's such an important one, and it's really such a not only broad but deep and complex kind of issue to unpack. So, thanks for taking this on. I guess what I would just share initially is that we are, as Nikkei in North America, I think there's a lot of different factors in play here when we're trying to really address sort of differences and conflict and trying to understand identity, I think. And, not necessarily represented here, but we are a very, very majority now multiracial community. Um, and we're multi-ethnic also. And I think that sometimes doesn't get mentioned. And I think we have to start from there, remembering that like there is no monolithic um, group culture here. It's many, many different experiences of people coming from different backgrounds with often navigating different forms of oppression and trauma. And then we are a community. We're and there's something really beautiful about that. And I think there's real challenges at times too. And I think we're getting smarter and smarter about trying to acknowledge it. And I think that's a big win for us. So thank you for this conversation, because I think this is part of that getting smarter piece and figuring something out. One of the things I like to talk about in this arena is that I think one cultural piece for Nikkei folk, and again, this is a generalized statement, it's not about everyone, but I think it is in play often, is that I think we're conflict avoidant. Um, it's a culture that doesn't like to point fingers directly at people and say, I have a problem with you, I don't agree with you, or you hurt my feelings, or I'm angry with you. In Japanese culture, really, you're not supposed to do that. And so I think, however, that has morphed into a culture within North America, I think that sometimes that creates really challenging dynamics for us. I am close to Dr. Satsuki Ina, and she has really tried to help me because I struggle with this myself. But we talk about it as organizers, and we talk about it as friends. And one thing she continually holds out is stop triangulating in your conversation with people. If you have an issue or you need to talk to someone, speak directly to that person. Don't go through an emissary. And we tend to do that. I notice it a lot, and it's for different reasons we do it, but actually it can create a lot of confusion. And so that's one thing that I've been working on in my own communication skill set, is around trying to speak directly to somebody. And what I found is that I have to come up against a lot of discomfort sometimes in order to do that. I was really trained not to speak directly, especially if I have a conflict with somebody. So that's one thing. I think another thing is that as a community, that was really maybe coerced. We were certainly forcibly removed during the war. We were surveilled. We were forcibly rounded up and removed. And in one generation, because of that forced removal, we went from a largely like agricultural and fishing and sort of that kind of community. And then we were dispersed. Dylan Myers, who ran the WRA, considered it one of his greatest victories that he basically assimilated us, meaning he basically took us out of our communities and then dispersed us across the country. And a lot of people were not able to, at least initially, come back to their home communities. And I think when you do that, you then set us up to play a very central position in model minority dynamics. And I think our younger folk have grown up with more of a conversation about this than some of the older folks. And I sort of feel like I'm in the bridge. I'm what I refer to as Sansei Han. Like on one half of my family, I'm Yonsei. On the other half, I'm Sansei. And so I have sort of fallen in that generational middle gap often. And it's really interesting because I've sort of experienced, I think, both of the generational sort of dynamics around model minority. And what I'd like to remind people is that nobody chose that. That's something that was actually a sort of form that was really forced on us. And then sort of we were manipulated into that role. But like when you destroy somebody's culture and take them out of their homes and then don't allow them easily to go back there, and then you provide this sort of, oh, try this instead, and we're going to offer you this sort of false choice, and we're going to basically manipulate very terrified people into playing a role that it's like we're going to dangle a carrot in front of you and we're going to give you a small benefit, but you will be used against other people of color. And what does that do to you as a group? I think that's a form of trauma that continues post-war. And I think it's important for us to recognize that as a wedge, not only between us and the Black community and other BIPOC communities, but also within our own community, on top of wedges like what they did with the resistors and the no-no families, and how we were turned against each other and really to this day have not healed that rift. And so, you know, there's a lot of trauma dynamics in play here. And if you were not, I have a lot of friends in Tsuru who really found Tsuru as a place to connect to the Japanese American community experience. And it aligned with their values. But some of them have not grown up near Japanese American cultural geographic communities. Some are multiracial, multi-ethnic. Some didn't know their family members who were incarcerated closely, or maybe it was their grandparents or great-grandparents. And where we have not been able to talk about our experiences very openly, I think then these dynamics all become very complex. And then we start to have sort of tensions between about lived experience and perspective. And it often flares, I think, around political discussions about, you know, how do we be in space, in movement space, or in liberation, in solidarity with other communities, but also I sort of keep coming back to how do we be in solidarity with our community? How do we be in solidarity with ourselves? And I've had to work very hard on trying to sort of resolve the inner conflicts I have still from growing up in a family that was incarcerated. I'm a descendant of survivors. Maybe we can talk more about that later, but I'm going to pause now and I'll pass it over.
I guess that leaves me, so I'll go next. But hi everyone, I'm Rikio, and I'm really honored to be here today. I'm also, well, I'm Yonsei, and I grew up in Los Angeles. And there's so many of the threads that I've heard from different speakers today that really resonate with me. And so I'll focus on maybe 3 or 4, but I wanted to build off of something that Mike had just mentioned with regard to the diversity of experiences, backgrounds, and ways of being in the Japanese American community that we see now. And I remember when I was growing up as a kid, I was fortunate enough to be around Japanese American basketball leagues and church or temple communities. But it seemed at the time like there was sort of a particular way of being Japanese American, of being like rooted to the community and of being, and it wasn't one that I entirely fit with, or at least at the time I didn't feel like I fit with. And it wasn't until I actually went to Japan and was teaching English there that I reconnected with a Nikkei community that seemed to be an odd and eclectic mix of transplants and people seeking their own understanding of what it means to be Japanese American, especially being back in Japan. And there was an event that I remember distinctly called Kimi no Identity. And in this room were a very wonderful mix of like mixed ethnicity Japanese diaspora folks, people who were Nisei or Yonsei or like Hikokushijo. And I just remember that there was this very powerful sense of there's not one way to be Japanese or Japanese American. And it's not as if we need to seek that validation from Japan or from some community at home, or I think there was just this sense of there's beauty in this diversity. And it was one of the first times that I had really felt that. And so I thought that what you shared, Mike, about not only finding solidarity across communities, but even within community is so powerful. And yet I think it may require sort of questioning certain ideas that we have about how we've defined our community. And I think that's where Dr. Chandra's pieces about humility are so important. Having a humility to recognize what we perceive to be our community or what is normal or what is expected is very much limited by our own experience and what our family has shared with us. So our perspective is necessarily limited, and I think it can be challenging to recognize the limits of our own understanding and experience. But I often find myself needing a gentle reminder. Do I want to feel right, or do I want to try and get it right? And I think in that endeavor, it often requires of me to remember that just as my own experience has informed my own way of thinking on some issues of racial justice or issues of solidarity, or like really challenging the model minority myth and maybe problematizing certain senses of pride that we have as having made it, that I recognize the perspectives of the people around me across generations are often not ill-intentioned by any stretch, but they're just formed as a result of a particular set of personal experiences that I just don't have access to. And so again, that requires some humility. And so I think building solidarity across generations within the community and then across communities requires this, or is very much facilitated by this kind of humility and recognizing the limits of our own understanding. I think one other comment I wanted to make was regarding a tendency perhaps in our families or in our community of wanting to be a bit conflict avoidant. And I think that one of the threads that's emerged in the last few decades for issues of social justice is sometimes conflict, being averse to conflict or speaking out, not wanting to speak out and wanting to just keep our heads down reads more and more like being complicit, which I think is again like how it reads to people in my generation. But again, I think the way that reads and the reaction to how that's perceived is again informed by a particular set of personal experiences. And so I think learning to have those difficult conversations, which is very much a challenge. I remember having like multiple different difficult conversations in 2020 about racial justice with members of my own family, and realizing like, oh, I need to be better at having these conversations with empathy and understanding. I think that that's challenging, not only because all of us feel, strongly about these issues, but because there's also these cultural dynamics that we're sort of pushing up against. And I don't really think there's an easy way out of those conversations, but or easy way out of that situation, I suppose. But I do think that the work that Dr. Chandra has shared about humility and about not just cultural competency, but again, this sense of like ongoing reflection and learning, and that sense of humility is really a great starting point. So with that, I'll pause. I know we have probably other kind of questions and discussions based on folks, but I'm really eager for what's to come.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. Can I go ahead, Julie, or did you want to say something? Okay. Yeah. Thank you all so much. There's so much wisdom here in this room, and I think I'll go to an Ubuntu proverb: "People become people through other people." So we are our relationships, and I think the different generations have different experiences of vulnerability and safety. And my mom, as an immigrant mother, I think also had a similar kind of keep your head down and just do the work. And I think many of us as immigrants, I know there can be also, similar to what you said, Mary, one face within the house and a different face outside the house. And those are kind of similar themes. And this speaks to the idea of layers of consciousness, which can be compartmentalized for some generations. And and can how do we integrate as opposed to assimilate? How do we integrate the layers of our consciousness? I think probably all generations, even in the older generations, I think there was quite a wide variety amongst Japanese Americans of speaking out, of being going into conflict versus being conflict avoidant. I mean, the whole range is true in community. And I think each of us have these intrapsychic layers of, just trying to figure out how to, and I think ultimately connected to the bigger causes of really advancing social equity, safety, justice, and so forth, racial justice, allyship. I mean, we're carrying that. Well, and it's like it becomes a challenge, I think. So humility helps us slow down, I think. But as I said in my article, sometimes Asian Americans are kind of stereotyped as humble, quiet, silent, and so forth. And I think that's something we should push against, because that's something that's laid on us. And maybe in our if you could stereotype our cultural traditions, which it's not true when you look at actual history, you can look, okay, so our spiritual traditions, Buddhism, and so forth, tend towards contemplation rather than as a deep precursor to action. And so, I mean, these things come into play as well. But I think it really, when you're connecting these layers within yourself and they come out in conflict, it's like then we're aware of more of what's going on inside of each party, and then ultimately to become ourselves and to help everyone else on this path of identity. I think working through the conflict and having better tools to work through conflict, because the goal is for us, as Mike and Rikio said, is to become community and to become together as we more together, because there are so many forces that want to tear us apart, that say that an Indian American should not have allyship with Japanese Americans, right? I mean, there's so many pressures on this, or that Japanese Americans and multiracial Japanese Americans should not, why should they be allied and so forth. I mean, there's this, there's so many distorting pressures on us. So that quality of coming together and I think mainly focused on the vulnerability that we carry as not being part of this the dominant culture that exclusively say white male Christian culture, for example. We're different than that. How do we bring change? How do we bring ourselves? How do we become ourselves in the face of that pressure? I think becomes a question. So yeah, I think conflict I think is unavoidable, but how can we use conflict to become ourselves and to become deeper in relationship? Um, and it's a continuous challenge. We're all works in progress.
Uh, I like to comment on that. I think it's difficult to articulate your feelings. We think that we need the right words. So, Ravi, when words don't come, what do you suggest?
Hmm. Wow, that's hard. Yeah, I think yeah, it can be. It takes a lot of time, I think, for feelings to find their outlet, right? It just does, and sometimes our words may not reflect the depth of feeling. So I think so that's we do our best, and sometimes I think I have to pause and just say sometimes I hear words that hit me wrong, but that's just coming from one part of the brain. Maybe the there are other parts and to the person that I have to also appreciate. And so we're trying. It's a hard task. I mean, I think feelings are complicated, but feelings are what connect us and disconnect us. And I think connecting to the deeper feeling of connection, of interrelatedness and interdependence, that is a steadying force. Uh, um, yeah.
Well, I was thinking back to my mother because she spoke Japanese and I didn't understand it, that we had trouble with words, understanding each other. And then I'm also thinking a child like Julie, when she did something I didn't like, and she couldn't understand why I didn't like it. Her vocabulary and my vocabulary didn't match. So I'm thinking sometimes words are inadequate, and there has to be other ways of expressing your thoughts.
Uh, I would like to say something about that, Mary, because I think that's really just really vulnerable and transparent, honest, sharing. And I want to thank you for sharing that. And like I sort of think back about my grandmother, my own grandmother, my own mother, my father. I didn't know my grandfathers. And I look at myself sometimes now as I think more and more I'm starting to be seen as someone who's older rather than younger, whatever that means in the context of our community. But um, there's these certain cultural responses that I observed as a child, and I don't even know quite how I absorbed them, but I have them. And I notice they come out sometimes in my relationships and how I communicate with other folks. Oops, I think we lost Ravi for a moment. I'm sure he'll be back. But like what I notice is that when I look at it generationally, and then I try to actually put an overlay and understand sort of like generational experiences, it has helped me a lot, not only in understanding other people's responses, but also understanding my own more a little bit. I can share something. We have been, Tsuru for Solidarity started as a multi-generational, protest movement. And in some sense, it was really trying to take a position against the like silent, like we were breaking the silence, so to speak. And when we went to like Fort Sill in Oklahoma and we committed civil disobedience multi-generationally in front of that fort, to stop the incarceration of children, um, I mentioned that, like, I think we do have a cultural issue with conflict avoidance, but also what I observed there was that our community has a very strong voice of resistance that may have been suppressed or targeted. I think of my friends who I've worked with closely at the Tule Lake Pilgrimage. The Tulians really have held the flame of resistance. Like I see the courage of that community and what happened to people for taking very courageous stands there on principle, and they were really attacked. Even by our own community, not just the US government. And so there's something there that I really hold as really a light in the darkness, and I aspire to it. And it really guides and inspires me. And that said, like, so we had this retreat. This is, I would think an organization that has really tried to really embrace those ideals of resistance and solidarity. And what we have seen is that as we've worked very closely on some really challenging social justice issues in the last few years, that some of these dynamics are coming up between generations, maybe in other ways too, but I can see it anyway more clearly around age generational lines at times. And so we had our first leadership retreat in 3 years, really because the pandemic prevented us from being together. And we spent several days together. And the first couple days, we did nothing except just try to enjoy each other. We went to the National Seashore. We cooked food together. We made sushi together. We sang and we danced and we made art together. We made jizo together. And then on the third day, we had a full day conversation about intergenerational dynamics and conflict. And what we did is we committed to a year-long process that we will have. And that one-day workshop was just the beginning of a kickoff to that process. But what we did in that one day is we broke into age cohorts and we talked about our experiences growing up. What was it like for you? And so I was in the group that was like between, I think it was like 50 to 65. And it was amazing what happened in that group. I have always felt like, wow, I found my people with Tule Lake and Tsuru for solidarity. But in this cohort, I felt like, wow, I found my siblings is how I felt. And actually one of my siblings was in that group, but it was like what we talked about, this very beautiful sharing about growing up in the post-war and the trauma in our families, and actually even violence in our families after the war because they didn't know how to process what had happened to them. And we then went back to the main room, and each of the age cohorts, there were like 5 or 6, spoke back to the rest of the group and shared our experiences. And I can't tell you, something melted in that room and we became one. Like there was a sense of we're in this, we're family, and we can hold each other. And from a place of like feeling tension, like you don't understand me, our political values don't always align, that became secondary in that moment. And we actually we held each other. And I was amazed that result happened that quickly. But when you give people a chance to be listened to and share, I think we approach it with curiosity, wonder, and a desire to understand. I think really important things happen. And we talk about healing the trauma. And I realized, I was like, oh, this is the healing of the trauma. And it can look a lot of different ways, but that was a really simple but profound way, I think. And so I'm really excited and interested to see what will happen over the course of this next year um, Betsy Hasagawa, who is a well-known group psychologist and movement dynamics consultant. She's Japanese American Ainu heritage. She's also from a Tule-like family. She's leading that process for us, and I'm so excited for what we're going to learn about this and where we'll end up, within the course of a year. So anyway, I wanted to share that because it feels very, very, very prescient and very important to like the intent of the conversation.
That sounds really amazing, Mike. And it sounds a lot like the kind of beauty you attained or saw, Rikyo, in Japan when you were with those Nikkei people, and everybody kind of had this unification, right? Um, well, that's wonderful, Mike. I hope that, and I think one thing that you said that struck me was you said everybody had this desire to learn, and I think that that's a key place to arrive at for everybody, even if they're all different, right? Um, and I think there is this need and desire, like we're having these Zoom rooms tomorrow, because there is an Rikyo, maybe uh, you talked about this a little bit, at Heart Mountain. I think we observed that there was real desire to connect, you know, amongst across generations, but also intergenerationally. And so Kimiko's been running these these generational Zoom rooms. So we're having that tomorrow. So I think there's definitely a desire out there in the community and a need. And I think hopefully more conversations like this will bring it out more into the open, so we can all talk about it some more. We'd love to hear more about that process, Mike, as you go along that journey.
Sure. I'll just share, we haven't posted it yet, but we are going to have an open Tsuru town hall on November 13th. And Betsy Hasagawa will be leading. It's an outward facing community conversation about intergenerational dynamics. So it'll be a nice follow up to this conversation actually, but it will, the purpose of it is that we're trying to open our internal process up outwards towards the community as well. So we'll be posting stuff on the Sudo for Solidarity social media platforms, and people will have a chance to register if they'd like to participate in that process.
Wonderful.
One thing I also wanted to chime in on that both Julie and Mike just spoke to is the importance of that curiosity. And I think that why that registers is so important for me is it speaks to this one. I think it builds on this notion of humility, that we have to be humble in understanding what we know and what we don't know. A lot of things we don't know, but that puts us in the right frame of mind, I think, to have these sort of conversations. And I think, and I'm very curious what people on this call would say to this. I think that having that curiosity can allow these conversations that may be tense, that may have conflict, can allow those conversations to build connection. And I'm a fervent believer that you can build connection out of this conflict. But I do think that a large part of that is facilitated by having a starting point of curiosity. And I think that could be a challenge. I'm sure we've all been in spaces and in places where we want to raise something, or where we find ourselves, as Julie mentioned earlier, like talking past each other. And so what can we do to build that space of curiosity, or to make that curiosity a little bit more accessible to people? I would be very curious what people have found effective in that way, because I think that is such a powerful starting point.
Yeah, I just third vote for curiosity, empathy, understanding. And understanding is a synonym for love. And of course, I think that's what we all deeply want, is to be loving and to be loved. In a society which has drastically not been about that. In psychiatry and psychology, we talk about the basic fault, the dearth of loving relationships early in life. And I think this spans, I mean, there's so many, I think there's a great chasm in society, not just a basic fault, but a great chasm because society has so much been about power and holding power, and as opposed to having empathy, being close to vulnerability, developing compassion for vulnerability, and giving everyone human dignity. And so these conversations sound like a great way to connect and to be seen and to see others, to understand and to be understood, and to develop that body of understanding, and then to close that chasm. And I think that's an important part. If we get closer to community through these and closer to belonging, disconnection is at the root of suffering. The opposite of suffering is belonging. So a deeper sense of belonging as a result of this, I think that will be a great outcome.
I'd like to also add to curiosity in dialogue. I think people have to be honest. I think often I think among Japanese Americans, they gloss over things. They don't really tell what they're really feeling or thinking. And I think to be honest, that then you can have better understanding of each other. And I like what Mike said about Tsuru for solidarity, where your group did things together. You didn't talk, you actually did things together, like cooking, walking. These are all small things that help you get to know each other so that you can talk about the bigger issues because either you're familiar with them and you feel comfortable with them. And I think that's what's lacking. We do too much talking and we don't do enough doing together things.
I think I'm guilty of talking too much. but I have to say, Mary, it was 3 of the most joyful days I can remember in my life, actually. And that comes after a pandemic when so many of us have felt, the absence of presence, with physical presence anyway, with people, and to be able to be together again like that. And people recognized the opportunity and they were literally joyful. Like, I think that's the word I have to use. It was just joyful. And people just really absorbed each other. And there was such care. And it reminded me that that's how everyone is, actually. Like the humans are born that way. Like things, excuse my language, shit goes down and people get hurt in very substantial ways that make it hard for them to be part of the one with the community, the beloved community. But that, like, it's important for us to hold out of the potential that's possible for all of us, because if we give up on that potential, then what do we have, right? We've lost the luminous center. And I guess one of the things that, like, Ravi, I really so appreciate your writings and your teachings and perspective, because you do hold out for a spiritual strength within the human being. And I think that's so deeply important when we're talking about transformation of self and community and family and, really the planet and humanity. And I noticed you said you're a humanist. I also consider myself a humanist. I'm for human beings. And one of the things that we've started trying to engage also in a conversation, maybe some of you were part of this, and we're going to continue it at Tsuru, is a workshop series with Kazu Haga, who is a well-known teacher of nonviolence and does work within San Quentin around reconciliation of people on death row with the family members of people who were murdered. And Kazu comes from the sort of Kingian nonviolence school from the civil rights movement. And there's so many, I would say there's many different approaches to nonviolence, but there's some real principles that I think seem to be universal. And one is this sense of the internal versus the external, and that like it's important to have an internal practice to develop an internal strength. How else can you become an agent of transformation in the face of extreme violence if you don't have that internal practice already there? If you can't remain with yourself and accompany yourself through those worst moments. And I have loved getting a chance to sort of examine and pursue that area of study. And we're trying to bring some of that into the work at Tsuru, because what we recognize is that at the front line of protests these days, it's extremely violent. There's an escalation of both state violence and paramilitary right-wing groups who are wanting to harm BIPOC peoples. And so how do you respond to that intensity? And I think we respond with an internal practice that equals that intensity. So an intensity of nonviolence to meet the intensity of violence in this moment. But somehow in that process or in that engagement, it's helping us around our communication and relationships with each other. And I think it has to do with a principle of internalness, which is treat others as you would like to be treated. Like that's where I've been coming back to over and over again. If I treat other people as I want to be treated, then actually that puts me in a very good relationship with myself, but also the other person. Even if I don't agree with them, even if they don't like me, even if they wish me violence. And so I don't know. Maybe that's way too. I'm blowing up the conversation beyond maybe where we started, but for me, it's hard to not relate all of those things together. And I was really moved by the article on humility, Ravi, and as it relates to this, and really we're coming back to like, how have we each been hurt by the violence of white supremacy and racism? And how do we restore the beloved community with each other, beginning with ourselves, I think.
That's right. Abusive power is sadistic, and intergenerationally or personally, we've experienced that kind of sadism and cruelty, and it can set off a lot of internal shocks and vibrations and fractures. And certainly for me, empathy, compassion, humility, retaining my belief in human dignity and common humanity, etc. These are healing forces, and they always require cultivation, because I think, yeah, on the front lines of protest, especially we've seen recently that vulnerability is met with cruelty and attacks, right? To attack someone for their vulnerability, and I mean, how to foster a different, and sometimes we shove our own vulnerability down. We might criticize or attack ourselves, and so these kinds of things, or criticize someone else for being, revealing or emotional, or people. As a psychiatrist, I know people with mental health issues are often stigmatized and treated critically and with contempt even. So all of these ways of being aggressive towards vulnerability, well, what if we can shift internally and in groups to being compassionate and inclusive for vulnerability and distress, to help to help people be people. And I think we build. And I don't know about pressing forward and what, obviously we're many things are happening in society, but hopefully if we can cultivate these qualities within ourselves, we can add to the possibility of a less violent, less abusive kind of conflict. Maybe we can have more of a conversation around these things, instead of this aggression that seems to meet vulnerability being exposed, particularly vulnerability of marginalized communities.
Yeah, I really like that idea of having that internal practice. Um, yeah, and it needs to be done daily, right? To build and continue and connect. Um, I love it. I love it. Sign me up. Now I know it's not that simple, right? What are others thinking in the moment? And then I think we've gone over our hour, but it's been such a wonderful conversation. But if anybody else has any other thoughts to add to that.
Well, I'd like to talk about the monolith that people have mentioned about the Japanese Americans. After the war, we all wanted to be the model minority, and we didn't want to say anything that would disparage us, and we tended to accept all the, you know, all the, all the. I mean, people thought that we were humble and we're all such good people. But now that we've gone farther away, the diversity of our community is coming out where people have different opinions. And I think that's very liberating. But it's important to be able to speak out and yet have some semblance of continuity within the group. But we are changing. We are not the same as we were. We are not our grandparents, and we are not our parents. So I think that's interesting how we represent different shoots of the monolith. So maybe people would like to share how they feel they're different.
Sure, I'll take some of that. I think one of the things that I've wrestled with personally is um, in both kind of immediate circles and then also kind of in a general and more communal sense, there was certainly times where I grew up where I had a sense that we as a community of people of color had made it. And I think implicit in that sense that we had made it was a judgment cast on people who we perceived not to have made it and or were struggling to make it. And I don't think that those conversations were always framed in a way that were conducive to empathy. I think they were often like framed in a way that was like conducive to judgment. And again, I say this as someone who is like, I've had to really come to terms with like, oh, I bought into this for a long time. And so I think one of the things that Mary, you pointed to that's so powerful is as we have a growing awareness for our positionality as a community and our positionality as individuals within a community, I think there are, some unpleasant reflections that come up. But I think that those are really important that we lean into. And I know that Mike's work with Tsuru for Solidarity is all about this. And again, I think this the challenges in confronting this reputation, I suppose, that we have benefited from in some ways. And I think recognizing the privileges as well as the struggles that our community has experienced is not one that always comes easily. But again, I think, and I know we keep returning to this thread, but I think that's where both curiosity and humility are so important. Because again, I don't think it's about like, I want to, well, I think what can be helpful is challenging the sense that I need to feel right. And that's tough because that's, I think, a very intuitive and human desire to feel like we are justified and that our perspective is valid. But I think that having the humility to recognize that maybe there are things that we need to reassess and reevaluate, and with respect to our own community and also with respect to how our community is relating to other communities is really important. So part of that may be happening as a result of this growing kind of multicultural and multi-ethnic experience of being Japanese American. And I am very happy for that. But I also think that it is hopefully happening as a result of these kind of conversations and spaces and being willing to have more difficult conversations and then find community and connection through them.
Wow, I love that. Thank you so much. That's so well articulated, Rikyo. I really appreciate it. Like if we as a community could try to hold each other and have the conversations and try to understand the impacts of World War II. Um, I was very honored to be in the documentary Betrayed about, about the incarceration. And um, I can't remember Larry's last name. He's a very famous poet from Seattle. He was in that documentary, and he spoke and he talked about how terrified people were coming out of the camps, that they were like, you better behave because they could put us back in there. And that was a real fear. And like, maybe now I'm not from that exact generation of survivors, but like, I've never thought they would do this to us again. I think they'll do it to other groups, and they are. But for our survivors, I think that was a real fear for many, many years, and maybe still. And I get it, because they lived through something, that they have a lived experience, right? Um, I think it's harder for us younger ones to understand that level of fear and how that impacts somebody, and what you live through. I have family members who were murdered in upstate New York. They were massacred. The guy went into their house and blew them away. They were not in the camps. They were on the East Coast. But like, that's the like level of violence and fear that that generation carries. Um, and so I just keep wanting us to have a deeper conversation, to try to hold each other around, this is what is in my psyche. This is like where fear drives us into certain kinds of decisions. And when we understand it, then we can do better. But until we understand that, it's hard to make different choices, I think. And I feel like we haven't had that opportunity fully yet. I think Satsuki Ina started it with Children of the Camps. If you haven't seen that documentary, that's a very important documentary, because it opened up a conversation. But we need a continuance of it. And then now there's younger generations that need a chance to see that film and then have a conversation with our remaining survivors, I think. And I think that's the work right now, because I think, again, like, until we understand the level of fear that drives us as a community, it'll be hard to make different choices. I'll just quickly say one other thing, that I think there's shame is still here in the room with us all the time. And the way I see it is, for those of us who have had more privileges, we're not the survivors, we're their descendants. I think a lot of us have survivor guilt. Oddly, I feel like I was in the camps. I know that's a weird thing to say, but as the child of camp survivors, I feel like sometimes I have their memories in my head. I heard the memories and I carry their trauma. It's a very odd thing. And I've heard other Yonseis say that, but I didn't. And I grew up with certain privileges as a result of what they went through. And I think for some of us, we carry an overreaction, like we have to an overcompensation tendency around calling ourselves out or in, like around positionality of us as model minorities. I think we need to change it. We need to decolonize from it. And also, we need to do that with great tenderness towards ourselves and our people, because we didn't choose that. Again, we didn't choose that. We can choose differently now, but you don't get someone to change by sort of replicating the harshness and the violence that came at us in the first place. And how we stop doing that, I don't know yet. But I think conversations like this maybe help. And there's many things people are doing. Anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Oh, yes, yes, Mike. I mean, when we did this workshop, we put on a workshop, and I felt the pain. I did. I was crying at night, just sobbing. And, it seemingly out of nowhere. And um, I felt that too. And yes, I felt guilt at many times too. Like I was telling my mom just yesterday, we were talking about this panel, and I remember in 1989, and we had a speaker come to our college, and I was writing an article about the speaker, and one of our professors on campus was telling his story, and so I was writing about it, and he was saying, he was so angry. He's a generation older than me. And I was just dumbfounded because I was like, here was I was not angry. I'd kind of accepted the incarceration. At that point, I was 18 or 19, I guess. And I was like, wow, I never even felt angry about it. And so, I mean, over time that's changed, obviously, right? And, but yeah, I mean, I think you're right. We do have to have those realizations about ourselves. Like you say, lean into them, accept them, but then and then move beyond them. Um, but it's not easy. It's not easy. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, thank you, Mike and Julie. Um, I call these transmissions, historical transmissions, feelings, nonverbal experiences, and so forth, transmissions that come to us. And then I think we have to be a transitional space for these transitions. And how do we cultivate the warmth and spaciousness to hold that pain, that difficulty in relationship? Because I think no one can do it alone. It's not a singular task. This is a task of community. And then the community can become a transitional space to imagine and envision something for the future, which is different than our history and our memory, right? And so that's I think that's where we're at that nexus. I think where history and memory can be transitional, can meet our transitional space and transform. So I applaud the work that you all are doing. It's inspiring, and yeah, I'm glad to be a part of that in some small way.
Wow. Well, thank you, all of you. This seems to be a good place to finish our conversation. But if there is there one more thought someone wants to share, or there's something to add? Well, we've got all kinds of links, I think, that went in there. The Children of the Camps link went in for the film, Ravi's website. Um, oh, we have a question from the audience, so let's ask that right now. Perhaps Dr. Chandra can address the recent psychological publications showing a link between trauma and DNA changes.
Okay, so this is an evolving area, but there is uh, evidence dating back from World War II that stress and trauma experienced by parents, by mothers, can lay an imprint in terms of changes around the DNA, which express gene expression, which can lead to anxiety and different metabolic changes and so forth. But it's still an ongoing area of research, and I don't think there's been kind of a final answer about this. But yes, it is true that physiologically, there seems to be a transmission of stress and trauma across generations, and yeah. So I guess we'll have to keep our eyes open for more information about this. And oh, just to drop in a plug, there's a great book about intergenerational trauma, family trauma, and healing from complex trauma called Stephanie Foo's What My Bones Know. So I highly recommend that as well. Yeah.
And we also have on the Tadaima website a link to Donna Nagata's presentation on her latest research about multi-generational trauma. So if you think you'll find that very interesting, that link will go in the chat as well. And then again, tomorrow, I invite all of you to join in the multi-generational discussions, or rather, they are generational Zoom rooms. So And we have a Nisei slash Sansei survivor room because that was requested. And then we have a Sansei room, Yonsei, Gosei, and even a no-say room for people who might want to not identify as any of those, but want to be Nikkei, no-say slash Nikkei. So I hope you can join. Those you do need to register to get the Zoom link, but they're right there on the Tadaima web page. And thank you all for joining us. I thank all the speakers, Mary, my mom, Mike, Rikio, Dr. Chandra. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming today, and we hope to continue this conversation. So keep your eye out for Tadaima 2023, and we'll watch that Tsuru for Solidarity, Mike. And we thank our audience for joining us. And please share this conversation with people if you found it interesting or enlightening. So thank you very much, and have a
Thank you.
good afternoon, evening.
Thank